Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A with John Vervaeke. Thanks for being here, John.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
And my name is Brett, and we have a bunch of people who have questions for you tonight. And we will start with default mode. You have a question for John.
Hi, John. It's great to hear from you.
Thank you. Good to hear from you.
Thank you. It's very nice. Yeah, so basically, I have a question. It has to do with whether you think that there exists a cognitive fingerprint or cognitive style that sort of each individual has that sort of emanates from their mind. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. It's a personal example for
Sure.
you.
Yeah.
You refer to Greg Henriquez as not just resembling Aristotle at times, but literally being Aristotle. Um, yeah, so basically, I'm really curious on if, because there's a lot of really interesting factors here, right? It's that
Yeah.
not being block or anything, but you haven't actually talked to Aristotle. You've read him, right? So it's fascinating because it seems as though, at least to me, what you're inferring there is kind of, it seems as though you're kind of intuiting like a structural, functional organization of his mind.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you're kind of, I guess, in a participatory sense, you're kind of picking up. You're kind of it's not just a mimesis. He's not just mimicking Aristotle. To you, it feels as if he's embodying Aristotle. So
Yeah.
going back to
Yeah.
what I'm saying about the cognitive fingerprint or cognitive style, do you think that people have cognitive styles? And in a sense, if they do, then I kind of want to hear you touch on the idea of resemblance and mimicking,
Yeah.
or if yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
That's really cool. That's very cool. So in linguistics, they talk about idiolects. And an idiolect, so a dialect is a variation on a language that's shared by a subpopulation. And an idiolect is, to my understanding, I might get this wrong, and if I offend any linguists, they're allowed to call me out. But an idiolect is basically a dialect that's applies to a specific person. And so people definitely have individual variations on how they speak. And so I think it's plausible that that is reflective of individual variation on how they think and their cognition. And the same thing when you teach people Tai Chi. So everybody's doing the form, but everybody has their own specific way of embodying it because everybody's body is different. And so you have procedural idiolects, and I could go on and on. And so I definitely think that there's that concatenation of things that are specific. I'm obviously using idiolect as a metaphor. And so I think it makes good sense to think that the particular combination we have of personality, our own particular relevance realization machinery, our own particular bodies, our own particular psychodynamic history means that we are going to have a very specific way in which our cognition fits to the world. But like the idiolect, it's not sui generis. I think it's a variation on principles like evolution itself that are ultimately generalizable. So every idiolect, for example, still has nouns and verbs and subjects and predicates and stuff like that. So what I'm saying is I don't think this makes other people's cognition inaccessible to us. There are going to be parts of it that in a certain sense are inaccessible to us. And I've been talking about this to other people recently, and I got to meet Stephen Batchelor, and he wrote a really good book with a really good title called "Alone with Others." And this has to do with how people confront their mortality, and then in one sense, we ultimately die completely alone because there can be nobody with us in our mind as we're dying. But in another sense, we can't possibly die alone because our minds are filled with English and other things that we've got and perspectives that we've got from other people. So that's what he's trying to get at with this alone with others. And so to the degree to which we're with others, and that's a deep degree, we can pick up on other people's perspectives and other people's way of their sort of cognitive styles, and we can fit it to our own. I mean, And it's interesting because your mimicry question is exactly right. Like when you're teaching people Tai Chi, initially they're just mimicking you. And you can see that, and they have to go through that stage. But then it shifts from them mimicking you to them internalizing it. So what they do is they somehow synthesize the mimicry with their own body, their own right cognition, and they come up with their own idiolect of the form. And so I suspect that's what we're always doing all the time. We internalize other people in sort of a first stage of mimicry, but then we integrate it with our own particular cognitive style. And so we end up alone with others. We end up with our own particular idiolect that is nonetheless the variation from what we've internalized from other people. And that actually makes sort of good sense in terms of distributed cognition, because it means there's always generalization moving towards the whole group, but there's always differentiation as we move into the specific idiolects of specific individuals. Very analogously to how people, right, distributed cognition depends on individual people having different personalities in a very specific way. I hope that answered your question. That's how I think about it.
That was so fascinating. I really appreciate all the different discourse that you brought into that answer. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's a really interesting question because I've been, as I'm preparing for After Socrates, I've been really reflecting on the different ways out of the different Socratic traditions confront these two problems of mortality, which is this alone with others issue about us, and fatality, which isn't just mortality. Fatality is the way in which we are all subject to forces beyond our control, and death is one of them. And so the two things are bound together. And so my thinking has been moving over these topics quite a bit right now.
Sorry to cut you off. It's just that I just wanted for you to elaborate on the sort of phenomenological feeling I was kind of trying to hint on at you kind of feeling as if literally Greg is in some way embodying Aristotle.
So, I mean, the phenomenology of that, I mean, I don't think he's logically or categorically Aristotle or anything like that. Right, obviously, I don't think Greg, studied under Plato or anything like that. But what I mean is, right, it's exactly that. And that's why I use the Tai Chi analogy. Greg isn't mimicking Aristotle, right? Aristotle has been internalized. The way the Tai Chi student goes from mimicking me to internalizing it, and so I think to some degree. Not as much as for Plato and Socrates, but nevertheless, to a significant degree, I've also internalized Aristotle, and I don't just know about him, and I not just mimic him. And so I think the conformity, the participatory knowing, is between my internalization of Aristotle and Greg's internalization of Aristotle. That's how it feels to me. So it feels like the phenomenology is reaching deeper into Greg and correspondingly deeper into me. That's where the conformity is occurring, rather than at the level of just sort of the mimicry of behavior or the mimicry of patterns of speech.
That was great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. That was really interesting. Thank you for bringing that up. And then, like, I that's what I mean. I'm like, how deep can that deep go? Can we really? I don't want to say appreciate. I don't want quite right the right verb is. Somebody else's death. Can we really be with them? And what does that mean? And this is kind of a fundamental question, and it's sort of occurring to me more and more right now because COVID. I mean, death is always all around us and just two steps away from us. But COVID has raised its profile in very powerful ways, and so I don't have any. I'm not saying I have any powerful insights right now. I just have a lot of questions that are emerging around exactly this kind of thing we're talking about right now.
I love what you brought up, though, because essentially it's like one day, as you said in the meaning crisis, that you will die as well. But the thing is that the reason why I brought this whole question up is because I feel like you, John, have a specific cognitive fingerprint that is like very, very impressionistic to me, and it very, very deeply resonates with me. And that's the thing. It's such a good question about mortality and death, because it's the aspect of like when you die, and I might be still alive, I might be dead. It's the aspect of how much of you goes away. And that's a really good question. I feel like, and that's why I want to bring that up, because you to me, you emanate a very strong, like, I guess, a cognitive fingerprint, a cognitive style that is so unique. I just wanted to say that.
Well, thank you for saying that, and that's a really moving compliment. Thank you. Wow, thank you. Really, thank you. I hope that it's the case that that the second part of what you said is true, that you find it that it resonates and it's internalizable to you. I mean, having I like your metaphor. Having a strong cognitive fingerprint that doesn't resonate with others would make me, in some deep sense, a very bad teacher. I would be sort of imposing my ideas on other people rather than affording them to appreciate and internalize them. And I very much don't want the former. I very much want the latter. It's very important to me.
That's incredible, John.
So M. Capello has a question. They can't be here, but they've asked me to read it. I'm interested in your thoughts on Tanya Lerman's work on intensive prayer, on God talking back, and non-self-talk, and to what extent these psychotechnologies relate to internalizing the sage and practices mentioned in your own work. There's a bunch of sub-questions, but maybe, I don't know if you can cover all of them, but I'll throw them out there. Are these different ways of talking about the same thing, or different points on a shared spectrum of spiritual phenomenology? Where does the neuroscience research intersect with these experiences? Any and all further reading highly appreciated.
So, I mean, you guys know about Jun Sung, who actually has met Lerman and talked to her. I haven't. Jun Sung, I had a birthday not that long ago, and so as a gift he gave me When God Becomes Real by Lerman, which I haven't read. So I want to say things very tentatively. I think Lerman's work is very important. And it overlaps with somebody else's work that's very important, which is Yaden's work and the sense of being called. And so I think these are on a continuum. So many people have a sense of being called, but that's not quite the same thing as being addressed, as being spoken to. And so there seems to be a continuum in which let's take what I was talking about earlier. We go from internalizing another perspective to actually giving voice to it. And we do that in some of the practices. We do that in the philosophical fellowship practice, for example. We're specifically not trying to just talk about Augustine, for example, but give voice, presence Augustine. Now, not in any physical or supernatural sense, but take that internalization to the point where we allow a capacity that the human mind seems to have, and I think it's non-controversial, because we do it every night in dreaming, which is we create voices other than our own and entities other than ourselves, and we can enter into dialogue with them. And in lucid dreaming, we can even talk to them and find out there's pretty good evidence that they have perspectives that are independent of our egocentric perspective. And then there's the third man factor, which I've talked about and John Geiger has written about. I've experienced it once or twice in deep meditation. Other people have experienced it under more extreme circumstances where you have a sensed presence that's outside of you. So all of these things are on a continuum, and I think they reflect a tremendous capacity that we're not studying. I want to be careful here. We're studying it a lot now, and Lerman is taking the lead. A tremendous capacity we have to double ourselves or to triple ourselves. I'm not going to stick on a particular number. There's something beyond internalizing the sage that goes into feeling called, and people often speak as if they get a calling from Jesus or from the Buddha or from Lao Tse or from Muhammad, to actually giving a kind of voice to that. And that doesn't mean you're insane. Socrates had his daemon. His daemon would call to him. I don't quite know what that means phenomenologically, when he was about to do something very, but it was sort of very irrational or immoral. And I think, and this is something Junsung and I both repeatedly say, I don't think people should fool around with these psychotechnologies. And Lerman is certainly not doing that, and I'm not in any way attributing that to her. But I think these are psychotechnology, and there's intermediate things, like, so when the shaman takes on the identity of the antelope, I think it's in between hearing the voice of the antelope and merely having internalized the antelope. So the depths of this continuum, where we go from mimicry to internalization to being called to giving voice, to the voice taking up a semi-permanent existence. So there is a vast network of people that are not psychotic or in any way mentally disabled, but they hear voices. And like, I've heard interviews with these people, and they do amazing things if when they enter into cooperative relationships with their voices. One guy talked about how when he's at his party, he'll use his mind to keep track of one conversation and ask the voice to keep track of another, and then tell him later what was going on. I don't quite know what to make of that, but I think there's enough convergent evidence to indicate that there is a way in which we can run more than one consciousness on our brain. And we already have good evidence for this from hard neuroscience. When we cut the corpus callosum, the right and left hemispheres seem to be run as independent minds that are aware of the world. And this, of course, is where you get the alien hand syndrome. And we don't like to think about this. Well, I'm going to talk about it with Greg and Chris when we do the elusive I, the nature and function of the self. We like to think of the self as this solid, unchanging substance, monadic thing. And that's what we are. But I think it's much more that we have a capacity to take ourselves deep along this continuum, from internalization through calling, through sort of third man factor doubling, to having sort of voicing something, to actually making it kind of an entity. That certain religious ecologies of practices train people on that continuum so that they come to be, I don't want to say possessed, because that makes us think of Linda Blair on The Exorcist. I'm going to use an old Greek term, entheos. It's where we get the word enthusiasm, and that means to have a God within you. And I think what Lerman argues is something like that. We have psychotechnologies, ecologies of practices that progressively move people along this continuum until they experience entheos. I don't think people should fool around with that. And of course, I don't think the religions do. The religions typically do this under, I think of these practices like psychedelics. They should be used within an established ecology of practices that has independent and significant training in the cultivation of wisdom for dealing with self-deception, for cultivating integrity, so that you don't get blown apart by this kind of experience. One of the reasons why I think Socrates entered into so much dialogue with other people was so that he got good at dialoguing with his daemon. And so I think this is really important cutting-edge cog-sci stuff. I'm looking forward to reading the Lerman book. I'm going to read it soon. And like I said, I want to bring this into this aspect of Socrates and the Socratic tradition that's always percolating along underneath, and that it comes back into full fruition in the Neoplatonic tradition, because in the Neoplatonic tradition, they developed this new psychotechnology called theurgia, in which you're trying to create something like entheos. And they think of a state beyond entheos. They think of a state called theosis, which is still the word for salvation in Eastern Christianity. And theosis is when you become fully identified with the God. And I take it that means that the internalization continuum has gone so deep that it's gone down into sort of the fundamental grammar of the self, down to the participatory level where identity and self is being formed. And so I think all of this is deeply important, deeply intriguing. And I, just like psychedelics and other things, people shouldn't fool around with this stuff. People shouldn't fool around with this stuff. I think we should have people like Lerman and others, myself, right, who are studying this carefully and scientifically, and then we should pay attention and pay very close and respectful attention to the religious traditions that make use of these practices. Pay very close attention to the clinical psychologists who tell us individuals where this whole process can go terribly awry, and come up with an ecology of practices that taps into its powers while significantly ameliorating its perils.
Thank you. Kasia has a question that they'd like me to read. I've been meditating daily for months now, using guidance from your videos. I still find even the rooting process to be so full of distractions for me, and I have to keep returning. I struggle with perfectionism, and if I get distracted, part of me feels I've ruined it, and I have to start again from the beginning. This thought further distracts me. Sometimes I just move straight to focusing on my breath to avoid the conundrum, but then I feel I may not be setting myself for a good practice. What do you suggest if I massively lose focus during rooting?
I think your intuition that you should just follow on the breath until all of this starts to die down enough is a good intuition. In one of the videos, I do an exercise that's sort of a faster version of rooting, where you sort of open and close above your head and then within your head, and right. And I would recommend that as a faster rooting. It still gets very powerful root going. Not as deep as the rooting I taught, but that faster version typically can get people into it without as much distraction. But doing the rooting, trying perhaps following just the breathing until things start to calm down for you. If you find that it then shifts to the breathing, and even if you don't, I'm going to recommend this either way. You need to be doing a moving mindfulness practice. You really need to do that, because you need to put a little bit more external demand on what you're doing, and especially a moving practice like Tai Chi Chuan or yoga, because that has the advantage of sort of filling your mind with motor sensory information in a way that really constrains the monkey mind space. And it also gives the perfectionism a project that it can discharge itself on. You can sort of say, I'm going to get better and better at the Tai Chi Chuan and the yoga. But however, what can happen is that, the perfectionism then moves there, and I'm not doing Tai Chi until I'm doing it perfectly. And if you're finding that the perfectionism moves whenever you do, no matter what set of practices you bring up, I don't know you, so I'm saying this with care in both senses of the word. I care, I'm concerned, but also I'm being careful. That if it keeps happening in that pervasive way, I think you might want to talk to a professional therapist and do some work on where that perfectionism is coming from. Maybe you need CBT. Maybe you need internal family systems therapy. Maybe you need emotion-focused therapy. Perfectionism has different ways in which it takes root in us. Now, saying that may be the case. It may be that you do the faster rooting and you just concentrate mostly on the breathing, and the perfectionism just sort of dies away. It may be that you need to go to the moving practices, and then that's good enough. But if you find that no matter where it goes, it's following you, and the meditation on its own might not be enough to get at what's driving. Like if it's very compelling and it keeps consuming any project you're engaging in, you might need a complementary set of psychotechnologies from clinical psychology. Now, this is not that uncommon. I think I've mentioned it many times in this series, and it's why I taught the wisdom of Hypatia as well as the meditation. Many people advocate that many therapists advocate for like in mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy or in dialectical behavioral therapy, that you need to integrate mindfulness practices with these other kinds of psychotechnologies if you're dealing with this kind of very trenchant kind of perfectionism and associated and attendant anxiety. Like I said, I don't know you and I don't know what's going to happen. I recommend trying those changes stage by stage. And if you find that the perfectionism is just keeps going, then I suggest you seek out some therapy, working with other people. There's nothing wrong with going to therapy. I've been through therapy twice. It's a powerful, important thing to do. We should remove the stigma from it. All we're doing is going to people who can give us powerful, like role playing, serious play, while they teach us important and powerful psychotechnologies. And I think learning from them how to integrate the mindfulness practice with these other psychotechnologies might be what is needed. So try those various intermediate steps. Hopefully you'll only need to do one or two. But if you find, like I say, that it keeps following you, no matter what changes you make, then there's something deeper you might need to consider addressing.
Could you just clarify, I think they asked, when they get distracted during the reading, should they start over again, or should they continue on, I guess, after when they come back?
It depends. Like the phenomenology can vary. I can be sort of distracted, but I don't lose my root because it's sort of running on its own for a while. And if when you return to where you are, you're still rooted at that point, just continue from there. But if you find that you're completely uprooted and you've lost any sense of root, then of course you have to start over again.
Hey, Oystein, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks. Firstly, I just want to say thanks for the advice last time. I was the one having derealization experiences, and I haven't had them again.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
I'm now looking for some guidance because I'm in a really hard period in the journey. I'm experiencing sort of the terror part of the experience. To give you some context, so you can have it easier to give advice. I was also the one having meditation-induced hallucinations.
Right.
And I did the focusing practice on it, and I did the other things you recommended, and they've gone down. But I experienced that when I get into deep states, they sort of come back.
Right.
And that's sort of a recurring pattern.
Right.
I'm sort of having this what seems like being this like sort of from the cave metaphor, where I'm getting an insight, and then things change, like my experience change, sort of participatory.
Yeah. Right.
And that results in my body just being way more tense, and when I'm getting scared to go into mindfulness, I'm sort of having way more anxiety, like through the day.
Right.
Sort of feeling like a lost child in the forest, just probably with a map from you, right? So I'm just walking in the forest and it's all dark, and I'm just following the map. I also have the Sangha, so I'm really I'm deeply appreciative of having that. But there's still a profound feeling of being alone and scared.
Yeah. The aloneness is really. So you're touching some pretty deep stuff about the aloneness, and some of it's existential. We all, like I said earlier, we all suffer from this, and we all have to confront that. And many people don't. They don't confront it. The story by Tolstoy, Ivan Ilyich. I'm using mortality because they're connected. Ivan Ilyich always knew he was going to die, the way people know that 2 + 2 = 4. But one day he knew he was going to die. The words are the same, but the meaning is totally different. And so many people know as a fact that they're, in some sense, alone, but they don't actually confront it in a participatory, perspectival fashion. And so one of the things that mindfulness can do is bring us up with that as something we're aware of and encountering, not just something we have beliefs about and think about. And like I say, so there's an existential dimension in which we all confront that at various points. But there might also be, there might be a psychodynamic thing. I don't know your personal history, right? And I don't know if this, like, I'm not saying anything about you, and please understand, I'm just talking as a way of explaining. I'm not trying to diagnose you from a distance. That would be insulting.
Sure.
That'd be insulting to you and inappropriate for me. Like some people, this comes up because, you know, they have trauma around being abandoned, right? They've had parents who've abandoned them, or they have trauma about very significant betrayal. And so there's a part of them that they never allow to be connected to other people. And they sort of discover that completely alone part within them in meditation. I don't know. I'm not saying this is your case. I'm just saying that in addition to how we all have to face that kind of loneliness, many of us also, because of the way of our past has wounded us, we also carry particular wounds that bring with it that kind of visceral phenomenological loneliness. So one of the things I strongly recommend is, are you regularly meditating with other people at all?
Yeah. I'm following the morning meditation for Europe.
So what happens when you know there are other people? Does that ameliorate it at all? Or do you completely sort of lose touch with them, that sense when you're deep in the practice?
I don't think I'm aware enough to really realize it, but there's definitely, I get a lot from the practice with others, and being able to talk with them afterwards and share the experience. Really helps.
So I would put a priority right now on a couple of things. One is meditating with other people, right? And you need to do a practice that takes you into the depths of mindfulness without taking you into the depths of consciousness. And so the recommendation is going to be similar to what I said a few minutes ago, right? You need to be doing a moving mindfulness practice where you're trying to get more deeply into your body and into your world, as opposed to deeply into your mind. You need to teach your mind that the depths of mindfulness don't always mean the depths of your consciousness. And so I really strongly recommend you meditate with others when you want to do the sitting practice. Don't stop, but that you need to take up something like Tai Chi Chuan or yoga. And you can do that both with others and on your own. And I recommend trying to do also those initially, even by following somebody, like even a video, right? Because there's a sense of then doing it dialogically, not just monologically. And also you get a depth. You can start to get into the depths of mindfulness without getting into those like you said, the deep dark forest of your consciousness. So typically when I talk to people who are dealing with these kinds of issues and anxiety issues and separation, perhaps anxiety, or loneliness or abandonment or betrayal anxiety, or maybe just the existential anxiety, and it's hitting them too hard, too fast, I recommend they slow down, they give a priority to meditating with other people, and they try to teach themselves that they can get into the depths of mindfulness in the depths of their body, in the depths of their embodiment and embeddedness in their environment. And so you need to do something like Tai Chi Chuan. That also has the way of helping your body, if I'm not diagnosing you, if there is any idiosyncratic, the body remembers. Getting the body through to relearn itself bottom up can often help alleviate a lot of that trauma before you go back to trying to encounter it sort of at the depths of your consciousness. So that's what I would recommend to you.
Well, thanks a lot. That really helps. I will. Do you have any recommendations on starting Tai Chi Chuan?
There's a lot of good videos on like by different people. The problem is, like finding a teacher is like finding a friend or a therapist. Like you have to sort of hunt around and try out a bunch of people until you get one that clicks with you. But what you want is somebody who's interested in Tai Chi Chuan or yoga, not just to make you look good or to make you a good fighter, but they're really interested in the philosophy and the character development of the art.
Yeah, okay. I will take a look. Thanks.
You're welcome.
C. Sepinto asks, what's your take on the modern ontologies such as simulation theory or Homo Deus? Can they be considered as pseudo-religious ontologies?
So I'm not that familiar with Homo Deus. I am familiar with simulation theory, at least the versions I'm aware of. Hoffman and is it Hoffman's a scientist? I think somebody like Elon Musk has also sort of advocated for this. And I think they're sort of religious. Here's my take on the simulation thing, and the take has to be philosophical because it's completely a philosophical argument. So the response is, and it has to be, I think, in fact, philosophical. So there's two possibilities, right? One possibility is we're in a simulation and we can find out we are in a simulation. If we can find out that we're in a simulation, that means there's evidence that we can obtain that we're in a simulation. And then what we should not believe we are in a simulation until we get that evidence, because we never believe anything until we get evidence. But if we can find the evidence, we shouldn't believe it until we do. But if we do, then we should believe it. That's rational. If we can't possibly find out, then being in a simulation makes absolutely no difference. It makes absolutely no difference. There's literally nothing I can do, nothing I can see, nothing I can experience, nothing I can think. Nothing can make a difference. And if it can't make a difference, it is absolutely, utterly irrelevant to me. And what that means is it is irrational for me to give any attention or time to any proposal that is absolutely and perpetually irrelevant to me. So either I should completely ignore it because I can't possibly, and therefore it is absolutely irrelevant to me, or I should be open enough that when evidence is produced that can actually be evidence that I'm in a simulation, then I should believe when such evidence is produced. I take it that we have no such evidence right now, so I don't believe it. And if we're in a simulation that can't possibly be found out, I think it is irrational to give one more second of thought to it. So that's my take on simulations. And what I think people do is equivocate between those two possibilities in a really self-deceptive fashion. And I think that's what makes it a pseudo-religious ideology. It's actually not an ontology because I don't think there's a stable epistemology that attaches to it. If what we mean by an epistemology is a rational justification of our knowledge claims. So that's my answer to simulation theory.
But would you take the red pill or the blue pill?
See, the red pill is an instance of the first one. The red pill says there is a way of actually obtaining rationally evaluable information that shows you're in a simulation. And in that case, I would want to know if I am. I want the person to show me that evidence. Now, the problem with the red pill is it's not just a red pill epistemically. The problem is it's also an L.A. Paul transformative experience, because once you take it, you can't go back. That's like becoming a vampire or having a child. And then we are into the question about if there's no way of seriously playing with the red pill, what an odd sentence to be uttering right now, then I don't think you should get involved with it, because there is no rational way of deciding whether or not you should take the red pill.
I've just this last week been introducing my son, my eldest, to the Matrix movie, so we're getting
very, very good.
Exploring very, very good. Struan, you have a question for John.
Hey, John.
Hey, John. Good to hear you.
Yeah, it's good to hear you as well. I hope you're well. You've been speaking about Plato's, that there was like an esoteric tradition, and Wikipedia's got a entry on Plato's unwritten doctrines, and apparently it goes back to the Tübingen school, which is a German university.
I've read some of that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, is what you're talking about connected to them, or is it just coincidental?
It's just coincidental. I mean, I've read some of the literature, so because I didn't want to be dismissive of it, but I'm kind of like Gralkowski and other people like Hyland and a bunch of people that argue that there's two different sort of esoteric traditions. One sort of comes out of Neoplatonism, and Neoplatonism is based on and perhaps overemphasizes the text. But what we have to understand, and this is Hyland's point, is that the dialogues are pointing us to the fact that the text is actually set within a drama. The text is always set within a drama, and of course the drama is eventually set within a school, and the school is set within a history. And so I'm not in that the oral tradition model and the unwritten doctrine model of Plato. I think the ineffability is talked about very explicitly throughout Plato, where he says, a lot of this stuff can't be put into text. That's clearly what's going on in the seventh letter. But then he clearly tries to do the best he can with both the text and the drama. We're supposed to at least imaginally enact the drama of the dialogues and get a lot of the procedural and perspectival and hopefully participatory stuff in addition to the propositional stuff going on. Now, I think what's typically called the esoteric tradition, like what Verse Lewis talks about, isn't the idea about the unwritten doctrines. It's the idea that Platonism developed into Neoplatonism and then went largely was simultaneously absorbed into Christianity and thereby hidden to some degree or driven underground in those versions of Neoplatonism that weren't accepted by Christianity. And in that sense, it becomes esoteric. But that school that, I mean, and Aristotle says this a couple of weird lines about the monad and the dyad and stuff like that. But then the Neoplatonists go on to explicitly talk about that, and they don't talk about that as coming anywhere from Aristotle. I mean, from Plato's texts.
There's one paragraph that I thought in the Wikipedia entry which was very interesting, and that's actually the reason why I brought this question to you. So if I can just read that. It says, if the two principles are authentically Plato's and the monistic interpretation is correct, then Plato's metaphysics strongly resembles the Neoplatonic systems of the Roman imperial period. In this case, the Neoplatonic reading of Plato is at least in the central area historically justified. This implies that Neoplatonism is less of an innovation than it appears without the recognition of Plato's unwritten doctrines. The advocates of the Tubingian school emphasize this advantage of their interpretation. They see Plotinus as the founder of Neoplatonism as advancing a tradition of thought begun by Plato himself. Plotinus's metaphysics, at least in broad outline, was therefore already familiar to the first generation of Plato's students. This confirms Plotinus's own view, for he considered himself not the inventor of a system, but the faithful interpreter of Plato's doctrines.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything in there except the idea that requires this secret tradition of, unspoken doctrine that was passed along independently of the written text because we didn't want the people at large to know about it or something like that. You have to be careful because I strongly advocate. There's been a long-standing tradition, and this is what I meant when I said earlier about rejecting, regarding the Neoplatonic interpretation of Plato as somehow deeply inauthentic, deeply misleading, deeply wrong. Now, there's been a whole group of people, and I include myself among them, and other people like I've mentioned, who say, no, there's deep continuity between Neoplatonism and Platonism, especially through Middle Platonism and all of these things. And therefore, the Neoplatonic interpretation actually preserves a lot. But again, we should then take the Neoplatonists at their word. They claim, they are repeatedly citing Plato's dialogues to justify all of their doctrines, all of them. So if we make this argument, follow the argument they're making. They keep saying, look, here's a text, here's a text, here's a text, here's a text. Now, whether or not Plato has exactly a Neoplatonic view, I don't know. There's a lot right? There's a lot of similarities between the mystical aspects of Plato and Plotinus. But again, I don't think this requires a whole sort of subterfuge history of unspoken doctrines. I think the Neoplatonists are being honest. They're saying, we got this doctrine from this part of the Parmenides. We got this doctrine from this part of the Timaeus. We got this doctrine by trying to reconcile between the Parmenides and the Timaeus. That's what you get. And you have to remember the Neoplatonic tradition is also building on itself. You can see Porphyry, criticizing Plotinus, and then Proclus is Iamblichus is deeply criticizing Plotinus, and then Proclus criticizing Iamblichus, and then Damascius comes in and criticizes Proclus. It's not a dead movement, it's a living tradition. And so because it's a living tradition, I'm really hesitant to say everything in Neoplatonism goes back to Plato. I think that's also way too strong. So I mean, you're going to probably roll your eyes, but I think there's a deep continuity opposition, right? That there's a deep continuity between Plato, and an ongoing evolving tradition, including up till now, of Neoplatonism. And I don't think that requires like this idea of this cabal of people that were secretly keeping the real doctrines of Plato hidden from the unwashed masses or something like that.
Yeah, well, fair enough. I mean, I'm not really. I mean, it's just that you mentioned that the stuff wasn't written down, so it was curious to me. I'm not trying to cast aspersions or anything like that. But I do find the actual. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, I just found what you said funny. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I find the actual principles about the one and the indefinite dyad at least conceptually interesting. So I was just no, as I say, curious. But yeah, thank you. That's a fair enough answer. I mean, I don't really object to any of that. So
yeah,
thanks.
I mean, you can definitely see that doctrine emerging in the Neoplatonists, but you can see, I wouldn't say the same doctrine, but really important precursors in the Parmenides, for example. For sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my own personal suspicion, if I'm, just thinking things through, is that there's a, the conversation earlier went to fingerprints, and I just think that there's perhaps a regular way of looking at things that, it kind of, you can expose it in the way that people think if you look carefully enough, let me say.
Yeah.
I think that it, you can kind of see it in Plato, and you can kind of see it in the Neoplatonists, and well, not just there, you can see it, far and wide actually.
Sure. I think that's fine. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for that.
Very much.
That was fun. I like that.
Hey, Vinny, you have a question for John.
Yeah. So is it all right? Actually, I basically, you kind of answered one of my questions kind of throughout when you were talking about how a number of Platonic traditions kind of got absorbed into Christianity, and so
Sure.
the short version of that question essentially was just that, like, are you planning on doing a series at all on like specifically Christian tradition, or had any resources on that? But I think my second question is kind of a little more pertinent, which is essentially about addiction and addictive qualities, and like if there are any specific practices you think are specifically good for ameliorating that. And by way of comparison, I feel like at least in my own experience and from people who I've shown it to, that like finding your flow is good for people who like struggle with energy throughout the day. If you have, the first question is kind of a bit of just like a quick one, where it's like if you have any intentions of doing something like that, and then the second one is I think a little more kind of, I guess, existentially pertinent. Thank you for doing this, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, so when I talk, I'm gonna touch upon it in After Socrates, because when I talk about dialectic, I want to talk about Duns Scotus Erigena and probably maybe also Eckhart. But then but I'm also working on a series beyond that, and then which is the God Beyond God, and I want to talk about the various traditions that have moved in the direction of what's called non-theism. and Neoplatonism within Christianity. You see it in Erigena, you see it in Eckhart, but also you see it in the Kyoto School, the work of Nishitani especially. You see it deeply developed within the work of Spinoza. And so I'll touch on it, but I want to touch on it sort of from the other side of Christianity. So we've got a lot of how it was absorbed into a largely theistic framework, not always comfortably, by the way. Both Erigena and Eckhart were Eckhart was saved from the Inquisition by his death, and Erigena was basically declared a heretic, and he disappeared under very suspicious circumstances. This is not to put dispersions on Christianity, but I'm just saying, because other times Neoplatonism was taken very successfully. St. Bonaventure is a classic example of the cloud of unknowing. Or Dionysus, of course, is the prototypical example, and Maximus and Gregory of Nyssa, etc., etc. But it's fair to say, I think, historically, that the relationship between Christianity and Neoplatonism has been fraught and therefore a little bit one-sided or lopsided. And I want to take a look at the other side and the historical ways in which Neoplatonism went into sort of a much more, and cross-culturally and cross-historically, went into a non-theistic tradition, which I think is much more similar to what, for example, Plotinus has. And that's what I want to do on the God beyond God. And so I want to do that ancient thing, but like I do with my series, I want to put that historical argument into dialogue with a lot of current current theology, innovative theology, and emerging ideas that people have around reinventing the sacred. So the entire title of the series is The God Beyond God and the Reinvention of the Sacred. So that's what I'm planning to do after Socrates. I'm really hoping that COVID will let me do After Socrates, which I keep putting more and more work into this year, and then I can do The God Beyond God next year. I don't know if that means you have to change the name of the Discord server, but I definitely am doing a lot of work on that third series right now. And so that is definitely a topic I'm going to return to. Not quite the way you said, not sort of Neoplatonism, the Christianity, but trying to open that up into Neoplatonism more generally, and how it is being taken up in various ways right now and today. On the addiction thing, there is lots that you need. There's many practices that can help. The reciprocal opening practices that you find within metta and other contemplative practices are very important. The flow practice, getting people into the flow state, is a reciprocal opening. It's powerfully motivational. It's very counteractive to the way addiction is the reciprocal narrowing. Any practices that open you up and connect you to other people and the world more deeply, like Lectio Divina, can be a very powerful practice. What you're looking for is to give people a rich repertoire of varied practices that share the functionality of opening people up, getting them into reciprocal opening, because that's the primary way in which you take people out of reciprocal narrowing. Now, while you're doing that, you really have to also internalize practices for dealing with self-deception, looking for cognitive bias, looking for absolute thinking rather than conditional thinking, looking for spiritual bypassing. That's one way in which, one thing people do with spirituality that actually reinforces their addiction rather than ameliorating it. And so in addition to a repertoire of reciprocal opening practices, people, and you can get this through CBT, you can practice stoicism, you can practice active open-mindedness. You need to engage in a serious effort to internalize the right practices that help to significantly ameliorate self-deception. If you get those working together, so if the reciprocal opening and the amelioration of self-deception are mutually affording each other, you will start to build a powerful engine for getting you out of addiction.
And just for those who haven't gone through your whole series, could you just give a brief description of reciprocal opening and narrowing?
Okay, so reciprocal narrowing. So this is the work of my friend and colleague Mark Lewis on addiction. And instead of the disease model, he has a learning model of addiction. We basically learn to be addicted, but not in a propositional theoretical way. It's a perspectival participatory way. So let's say, right, let's do alcohol because it's very familiar and everybody's probably had some alcohol, so they have a little bit of phenomenology around this. So, I'm sort of anxious and I drink some alcohol. It removes the anxiety, but it also, it impairs I lose cognitive flexibility. For example, I become much more subject to hyperbolic discounting. It gets more and more difficult for me to think of the future, and present stimuli become more and more salient to me. So my world narrows. I lose some of the temporal depth of my world, and my world starts to shrink. And then that starts to impact on me. I start to internalize my world because you're always internalizing your world. And that means I internalize a world that's now sort of more pressing and urgent on me, which makes me more anxious. So I drink some more of the alcohol to relieve the anxiety, and that further reduces my cognitive flexibility. It further enhances my hyperbolic discounting, and I further lose the future, and I get more and more trapped in the present, and I get less and less able, because I lose cognitive flexibility, to solve my problems until I can't be any other than I am, and the world is totally pressing and unchangeable to me, and I'm locked in, and then that's addiction. That's reciprocal narrowing. Reciprocal opening is to do the other. It's to introduce some cognitive flexibility, especially at the procedural, perspectival, and participatory level, so I can start to see more deeply into the world, and I can start to distinguish real patterns from correlational patterns or artificial or projected patterns. And now I start to internalize a world that has more possibility, more space in it. So my thinking I check more possibilities when in my thought. I have more space between my thoughts and between my thoughts and my action. Become more cognitively flexible. Now I start to see more deeply into the world, and the world and I now reciprocally open up deeper and deeper and deeper into each other. That's, of course, what happens when you genuinely fall in love, as opposed to just infatuation with someone or something or some place, because, of course, we fall in love with places and things as well as people. And sometimes that's also legitimate, like works of art and our home, which is a place we fall in love with. And so practices that specifically train reciprocal opening are practices that try and get you to open up that, right? Like one of the ways I sort of do it is this, like when I'm sometimes using a mantra, may I be other than I have been so that I can see other than I have seen. May I be, right, other than I have been, so I can see other than I can have seen, so that I can be other than I have been, so I can see other than I have seen. And you can do that as a reciprocal opening practice. And you can do that. You can do that. You can do meta practice. You can do a lot of these practices that are designed and things that get you into the flow state, because the flow state is itself a reciprocal opening practice. I recommend you get a bunch of these, a rich repertoire, and they befriend each other and they support each other, and then you get the reciprocal opening. But always, and this Plato makes this like so, in Socrates so clear, reciprocal opening without cultivating an enhanced discernment of self-deception can go terribly awry. So you also need to do those practices that make you better at not confusing self-deceptive projection with actually opening up to real possibility.
Oh, thank you very much. That it really helps a ton. I look forward to the series that you have planned. I really enjoyed the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and also with regards to the addictive stuff, it's just it's definitely I've struggled with that, but I also just see like one of the things that it's interesting. Like one of the things that kind of came to me as well about that is just further kind of increasing as well, in addition to the practices, increasing the kind of embodiment of the practices and like sanghas and stuff, because so often I feel like one of the big things is, you know, the social drinker alcoholic, where it's like, well, you start to reciprocally narrow the possibility space of like a social encounter as being something where like substances are imbibed, and then it becomes just kind of this well, you use the Dostoevskian phrase like viler and viler, like it's like it's just kind of you just kind of keep like you said, reciprocally narrowing. So I'm actually starting a group soon with friends of mine about going through the Meditating with Vervaeke series, so I'm trying to embody that. So I'm glad that that's just on the right track, and thank you so much for your time and your thoughtful response.
Well, thank you, and I wish you the very best in your endeavor.
Jacob M. asks, can you offer any guidance to somebody beginning to be, or to someone beginning to, or in the middle of navigating the Jordan Peterson space? Are there lines of his Are there lines of his thinking that stand out to you that deeply align or don't align with ideas presented in The Awakening from the Meaning Crisis?
So, I mean, Jordan is sort of coming back, but not, and it's unclear. But I guess this will be the first time I do this publicly, and I don't know if this will in any way reach him. But I think, and of course I'm terrifically biased, but I've got a lot of people have said this, I think one of the best public dialogues he had, and he had it early on as he was becoming a god, was with me. And I'm offering to have such a deep dialogos with Jordan again, if he would like to do that at some point. Yeah, Jordan's hard. Jordan's hard because people are so bifurcated in the response to him. And I'm not bifurcated that way. There are people who demonize him and people who deify him. And it's never been natural or normal to me to do either one of those. Jordan was a colleague of mine, a colleague that I was on good terms with. We respected each other. We've met at conferences, we've had meals together, things like that. And as colleagues, and it even comes out in that so-called debate between he and I, we would criticize each other's work because that's what you do to help each other be better scientists. But it's gotten to a place where if I try to criticize Jordan at all, I just get jumped on by so many people. And I think, and people don't hear me when I say, you're actually if you make it so that you can't criticize him, I get it, you can disagree with me, but like people just, oh, you're an asshole and you're just jealous or you're just like resentful or how dare you talk about like, what? Like I've known this guy a long time when he wasn't a god or a demon, and it was natural and normal and expected that we did that as colleagues. We did it, and listen to the word, in a collegial manner. But I feel like I can't do that anymore. I guess I'm complaining, but what I'm saying is I've tried a couple times to engage with his work and trying to show where I think there's agreement and where I think there's disagreement, because our work, there's ways in which our work converges. We are, very convergent on a lot of things. There's ways in which our work diverges. I think Jordan relies way too much on Jung and narrative and ignores a lot of valuable cognitive science. And it's not that he doesn't ever look at the cognitive science. He obviously does, because he cites it in places. And I think Jordan needs to do much more cross-contextual, cross-cultural psychology. Philosophy. I've recommended to him in person more than once that if he wants to wrestle with nihilism, and he hasn't read Nishitani's book, Religion and Nothingness, that's a serious gap in his understanding, because that is a masterpiece and one of the most brilliant books ever written. And it comes from the Kyoto school, right? A Buddhist perspective on nihilism. And so there's issues like that, which means when I try to answer questions like the one I was just posed, I'm always hesitant. I'm always feeling like no matter what I say, because of this bifurcation, it's useless for me to say anything. It's useless for me to say anything. So that was a bit defensive, and I didn't mean to be. So removing the egocentric defensiveness. I'm trying to put a caveat on this, and I would say what I think I'm seeing is that the people I'm talking to in Dialogos, like Paul Vanderklay and Mary Cohen, they're not interested in that aspect of Jordan's work that initially propelled him to Uber fame, which is the political thing. Now, when I talk to Rafe Kelly, he's somewhat interested in that, but he's also much more interested in what you might call the religious, mythological aspects of Jordan's work. I would say emphasizing that aspect of his work is very important. And I am explicitly much more critical of, for example, his take on postmodernism. I think he gets postmodernism sort of significantly wrong in some important ways. And he also oversimplifies. And I think he's too influenced by Hicks, which I think is like that the work is really bad scholarship. So I would take with a really large grain of salt his criticism of the postmodernists. Not that the postmodernists shouldn't be criticized. I'm also happy to criticize them, and I've done it. But don't straw man them, steel man them. Really get their arguments. There's important arguments in Foucault. There's important arguments in Derrida. Take them seriously, and then respond to them seriously, but take them seriously. You can learn from them. And it's difficult, for example, to understand, right, that Jordan talks a lot about Heidegger and very, very little about Heidegger. And Heidegger is titanically important. And it's precisely Heidegger that bridges between Nietzsche and people like Derrida, but also between people between Nietzsche and people like Merleau-Ponty and Husserl and phenomenology, right? Not Husserl. Husserl influences Heidegger, but Merleau-Ponty is right coming afterwards. So, and then the tremendous impact that Heidegger has on people like Nishitani and the Kyoto School. All of that is missing, which means I would say don't take very deeply what he has to say about postmodernism and also what he calls cultural Marxism, because I'm not quite sure what that is, because I think it has something to do with his take on postmodernism, and I've given you my criticisms of that. And insofar as that, whatever that means, the cultural Marxist postmodernist thing influences his political vision, I would take I wouldn't start there, and I don't even know if I would end there. I don't mean to just sort of cast dispersion on his work. Let me now say a lot more positive stuff. I think the stuff he says about myth and meaning and the pervasiveness of self-deception and individual responsibility, the need for virtue, I think these are powerful and often insightful things. I think he confuses individual responsibility with individualism, which is precisely the kind of ideology that he otherwise criticizes. I think individualism is a very dangerous ideology. I think individual responsibility and the cultivation of virtue are very important things, and those shouldn't be confused together. But I think concentrating on the mythological, meaning, self-deceptive, developmental aspect of Jordan's work and how that overlaps with the cultivation of virtue, I think there's a lot of insight and value to be found there in Jordan's work. So sorry that was long and convoluted, but I explained why it had to be long and convoluted. And I hope you find that helpful. I would recommend starting perhaps with his biblical series or his Maps of Meaning series. These are harder, but I recommend doing them first and really digging more deeply into them. And then perhaps opening out from there. And as you do, especially as you come into his confrontation with postmodernism, his confrontation with what he calls cultural Marxism, and his confrontation with the left in general, and his his take on totalitarianism is also inadequate. Like talking a lot about totalitarianism without talking about the pivotal work of Hannah Arendt, deeply influenced by Heidegger. There again, his ignoring of the whole Heideggerian stream costs him. That also has to be taken with a grain of salt. There's some value there, but there's also some deep lacuna there. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks, John. That really helps a lot. I find myself constantly swinging somewhat violently back and forth between, deifying him and demonizing him.
Yeah.
And it seems like I can't go the third route and ignore him. Yeah, that really helps kind of center me on the issue.
Yeah. So I recommend not just listening to my voice on this. Take a look at what some of the interactions, because he's done a lot that Paul Vanderklay has done around Jordan Peterson, or also some of the discussions that Rafe Kelly and I have had around Jordan Peterson's work. That you might find those helpful as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I suspect that if this video goes public, I'll pay the price for what I said, even though I hope you all believe, because I think I sincerely believe it about myself without any duplicity, that I've always respected the man. And when he was being initially criticized, I wrote him emails saying, I disagree with some of your arguments. Here's my disagreements. And he responded and said, that's great. I like those. But I said, you should be treated with respect. You are offering thought out, often insightful arguments. And what should happen is people should respond to you respectfully with arguments that are given in a respectful and not dismissive or condemning fashion. So that is what I've tried to do here in my answer. So I hope it gets taken that way, because that was the intent.
Well, thank you, and I think that's an approach we should adopt for anyone out there. So thank you for stating that. Solid has a question. How did your understanding of the genealogy of the meaning crisis come about, and have you ever gotten pushback on
it? Well, the answer to the second is yes. I get criticism and comments, and I reply to them. And sometimes the criticisms are just right, and I'll admit I've made a mistake here or there. And I'm constantly revising it in various ways. How did it come about? Well, it came about that I won't do my whole biography again, but the idea is I had training both in philosophy and science. And especially the period in which I was doing the kind of philosophy I was doing under the influence of Heidegger, and also to some degree under, the waning influence of Hegel, that there's a deep connection, but also the influence of Foucault and Ian Hacking, who was at U of T, and Gadamer. And I won't keep dropping names. The point is, like, the philosophy and the history of philosophy are interwoven together. So I was being doubly trained in a philosophical historical analysis and a structural scientific analysis, and that I came to realize, because I just sort of naturally applied both of those to, and I was just doing it sort of intuitively and ad hoc initially, those to the problem of meaning in life. And then what started happening is I started to know that the science started to help me, figure out what history was more plausible. But the reverse, as I started to do the more plausible history, that gave me insight into how to do the science better. And so a dialogue was forming between the scientific analysis and the historical analysis. And so it's sort of like they met in the center, and then they reciprocally opened out from the center, and I went deeper and deeper into the history and deeper into the science in this coordinated and opening manner. And so that's how I did it. And that's why, of course, the series has the structure it has. You'll see after Socrates, we'll have the same kind of structure. The God beyond God will have the same structure because I think this is a profound way of trying to get a highly plausible answer to some of our deepest questions. Is it the final answer? If you've read my work or looked at my work, you know I would never say that. Is it an answer that gives us certainty? No way. I would never say that. Do I think my position is plausible and by and large defensible? Yes. And so typically what happens is I'll get pushback. People like, you've completely misunderstood Luther. And then I'll ask, for other people to, explain why Luther falls into the anti-Semitism he does. Why is there a connection line between, and the Nazis saw them themselves, Luther and Nazism. I'm not claiming Luther was a Nazi, but you need to give me an interpretation of Luther that makes that forward history possible and also makes sense of how, the science of the cognition of narcissism and self-deception work. That's how I worked when I was trying to give an interpretation of Luther. And of course, people will disagree. People, you've just got Luther wrong. It's like, okay, but do something that, this is how we play the game of intellectual inquiry. Do something that gives answers to all of these questions in as integrated a fashion. And sometimes people do that. And they'll say, look, and I'll go, oh, wow, that's right. But often they'll say, well, I can't do that. And then I'll say, well, then I'm going to stand by my interpretation because I think I've made a case for the plausibility of my interpretation. And so that's how I try to steer the difference from just saying, well, it is when I get pushback, or saying, oh, everybody's right when they criticize me. And right, it's like the martial arts, right? You have to learn, and I don't mean this in a Machiavellian or manipulative way. You have to learn when to give ground and be flexible, and you have to learn how to stand your ground or even advance. And you have to be fluid and flexible and fluent in that kind of back and forth movement. And throughout it all, right, you have to care about the interlocutor to the degree to which they are coming in good faith. So if somebody makes a criticism of my work, especially if I can enter into good faith dialogue with them, I've given lots of evidence that I've taken criticisms made by Paul, by Mary, by Jonathan, by other people. I've taken them to heart, by JP. I've taken them to heart and tried to respond to them. And I'll often innovate my thinking. And that's dialogos. I get an insight in dialogue with them that I can't come up with on my own. I will innovate my thinking in response. So that's how I came up with it. That's how I try to handle the pushback.
Default Mode has another question for you.
Hi, John.
Hi.
I just want to say this Q&A has been really, really fruitful. This is one of the best I've attended so far. So I just want to thank everyone for coming with really good questions. It's been awesome.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah. So a question that I have, I've kind of noticed this through all of your videos. It's a consistent trait of yours that you're a really good listener. And I kind of want to, take some advice from you in the sense of how to properly listen to someone. Because I have trouble with, listening to people in terms of me sort of blocking out what they have to say when a thought rushes to my mind and then I kind of want to say it. So I guess two questions. One is that what can I do to sort of become a better listener? And also in your view, what does listening really do? Structurally, Like, what does it really do? I don't know if that's a good question or not, but
There's a good question, and I'm trying to remember the name. Is it Fayorma, who's got the philosophy of listening, the other side of language? There's a lot of good philosophy out there about listening. Christopher Master Pietro and I've talked about it. Chris speaks often eloquently of listening. He's a master at it. And of course, I've learned a lot from Socrates. One of the ways, this will sound kind of maybe counterintuitive, but lecturing has actually been helpful. Now, lecturing can go exactly the opposite way, right? So lecturing can turn you into a monologue, and you're only talking to yourself. But if you want to be a good teacher, when you're lecturing, as you're speaking, you're always trying to, almost like a voice in your head, hear what people might be saying, right? And open yourself up to it. Now, that in itself could just make you manipulative. But what it does is it gives you the skill of kind of holding like your own voice and another voice in your head together. And then when I listen, as I flip them, right? If that makes any sense. So normally when I'm lecturing, my voice is central, and then sort of in close proximity, the voices of others are like your voice is right in my mind right now. I'm hearing things you might be saying, right? And so when I'm lecturing, my voice is central and the other voices are peripheral, but I try to give a lot of space to those peripheral voices so that my lecturing is always responsive. And when I listen, I flip that. I try to make my own voice peripheral and the space for your voice more central. But getting that sort of stereoscopic ability and being able to flip it, I found it's been very, very helpful in listening. And then secondly, learning to get into dialogos, where I deeply appreciate, in three senses of the word, understand and value and note the transformation that's occurring. The fact that insights can emerge between us in a way that can't emerge from me, or for that matter, from you. And that flowing taste, appreciation of that cutting edge of emergence, that appreciation of emergence, that lived, flowing appreciation of emergence, coupled to that sort of flipping I'm talking about, that holding of the two places, flipping the peripheral and the focal when I'm listening. That's what I try to do when I'm listening.
I really appreciate what you said about, I guess, valuing, because I feel as if when I'm like not listening to the other person and I'm not valuing them in some sense, like it's really interesting what you're saying about the central and also the focal and also the peripheral, because it's like when I'm not listening to someone, I'm becoming the central and I'm really just devaluing like all of the complexity that's going on in their mind. So like that, I really the psychotechnology of having that kind of like, I guess, stage swap, if you want to call it.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, what's center stage and what's off or what's center stage and side stage, not off stage. There's that reversal rule. Yeah, very much. And then what can happen, especially when you get into dialogos, is like you get like a third stage that neither you nor the other person is central, but the logos between you is central. Like what you care about most is not what the other person is saying or what you're saying, but how the logos is emerging between you. And then that's the most powerful listening of all, I think, because then everybody, even when they're speaking, they're listening.
That is awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Do you have time for two more, John?
Yes, I do.
Great. So Jacob M. has a question. Can you explain the difference between therapy and spiritual practice? When should you stop therapy, or should therapy transform to take on a positive psychology role and continue in perpetuity?
Yeah, I think the line between therapy and spirituality is a blurred line. There's a continuum there rather than an exclusive dichotomy. So generally, and there's things that blur the line, like things like philosophical counseling, which sort of stand between spirituality and therapy. But what I would say is the therapeutic role is let's say its goal has to help you to deal with very idiosyncratic problems and that are particular to your idiosyncratic history and development that need to be worked out therefore in a very close one-on-one fashion, and where the goal is to return you largely to normal agency. I mean, Freud said it a little too starkly, but the goal of, he said it in terms of psychoanalysis, I'm extending it to therapy. The goal of psychoanalysis is to return people to their normal state of unhappiness. I take it that what spirituality does is it's not about confronting your idiosyncratic problems. And again, I've admitted these overlap. There's a continuum between them. I'm talking about the emphasis at the polar differences, right? Take it that spirituality addresses perennial problems, existential issues, rather than idiosyncratic ones. Now, they can be very confused. I was talking earlier, I think, was it with default mode? If I misattribute this, I apologize. About, no, I don't think it was. It was somebody, I think it was a person after, I can't remember who it was. Anyways, that it's sometimes very hard to distinguish the existential horror. Sorry. Let me. I'm biasing it by my language. It's very hard to distinguish psychodynamic horror of loneliness springing from abandonment, betrayal, neglect, from the existential horror that befits us all as we confront our finitude, our own specific, unique mortality, the fact that we will pass into non-existence, etc. And so there's the loneliness that we encounter by being finite beings capable of rational self-reflection or capable of profound meditative exploration. But there's also a very, and it can be visceral and powerful loneliness that we can encounter because we've been neglected or abandoned or betrayed in a profound way. And those can overlap and intertwine. And although I can make the analytic distinction, getting pure cases where it's just purely existential or it's just purely psychodynamic are rare. They're often confounded and confused. A good therapist would help people disentangle, and to the degree to which they have the expertise, help them with the psychodynamic thing. They may have some existential therapy training, which would then allow them to start to bridge into more existential issues. When we get into existential issues, and especially when the response to those existential issues are things that involve overcoming perennial problems of self-deception and affording the perennial aspiration to self-transcendence and fulfillment, then I think we're into spirituality proper. So that's how I would answer that question.
And the last question goes to Struan.
Hey,
Struan.
Hey. Yeah, so the question I was going to ask was totally derailed by you bringing up Jordan Peterson. So I first of all want to just say, I think there's validity to your criticism of Jordan Peterson in terms of his individualism. Politically, I think, I kind of consider him a bit of a reactionary, as in he's got half the right story, but he goes too far. But the thing with narrative, so I mean, you've agreed with the narrative practice hypothesis, and I was just the question, or how I would phrase the question is, what do you think it would look like to practice the narrative of self-organizing criticality? And the provocative claim I would like to propose is that it would look exactly like a hero narrative, and I was just wondering what you'd make of that.
So, I mean, I don't have to do that work because it's been done by somebody else much better than me. So, Alicia Uraro, and Dynamics in Action, which is one of the most important books written in cognitive science in the last 20 years, and I keep recommending it. And whenever anybody takes up my recommendation, they acknowledge that their appreciation for this. I mean, she makes an argument, and I did talk about it. When I tried to do the stuff on narrative in the series, and I keep coming back to it. And I seem to be taking a certain role for people, at least as foil, which I'm happy to do, because if it helps people, that's good. That, narrative per se, the narrative frame is how we track dynamical systems, and so the narrative grammar itself, as opposed to a particular narrative, because of the way narrative works, the way it structures in terms of constraint. It feeds forward and feeds back, flash forward, flash back. It has different layers, right? A Gestalt layer and a featural layer that are constantly causally interacting, and it has emergent complexification, etc. And so she says, narrative puts your mind it gets your mind, and I'll use my language, and I think it's completely fair because she invokes Aristotle through all of her work. It gets your mind into a state where it's conforming in its manner to dynamical systems that you want to track in the world. And of course, self-organizing criticality is usually found within dynamical systems. So the provocative thing is, you say the hero narrative. So some differences that have come out in the debates and the discussions and the dialogos I've had about this. Many people agree with my criticism, but they criticize me. And I think, and Rafe Kelly did this, and I agree with him, that I think you might have said the same thing in one of your emails. I've tended to see the hero archetype as the hero warrior. But the people that make that criticism then go on, I think very charitably on their part, to say that they think Jordan makes that same false equation. Because I've often tried to emphasize the sage, and how the sage often has a lot of feminine characteristics rather than masculine ones. The sage often, and I'm reading a great book on Socrates, the sage often gives way to other people and is an affordance. And Socrates, of course, described himself as a midwife, which is a very feminine role and a way that makes space and give way for others. Now, if we expand the hero archetype to encompass those kind of feminine, that kind of feminine sagacity, then I'm willing to acknowledge it as a more plausible universal. But again, I would disagree with the Jungian interpretation that we're sort of wired for this because of the narrative practice hypothesis. And what you're suggesting, and what Uraro was arguing, that we come upon certain narratives and narrative structures and stick with them precisely because they give us an optimal grip on our world. Now, we might have evolved with a predisposition towards that, but I'm not so clear about that. And I still haven't heard one more point, and then I'll let you respond. And I still haven't heard one of my concerns, again, in the hero narrative, at least as I heard it in Campbell and as I've heard it in Peterson, which is, right, hear how the hero is in service, like how he serves the community and how he goes out and rejuvenates the community. But I don't hear very much about how he's in service too, in the sense that, how the community serves him or her, and how the community affords him or her. And this is my concern, because I don't think the hero narrative does a good job about distributed cognition. There, that's what I wanted to say. Listen to you.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I'm not saying the hero narrative is perfect. What I'm trying to say is that, you said that a narrative affords us an optimal grip, and my counter to that would be: isn't self-organizing criticality exactly an example of that optimal grip? Like, isn't that almost one and the same thing?
So that the self-organizing criticality, I mean, there it is, but there are many instances where we're not doing narrative, where we realize optimal grip. Perception is one of them, for example.
Right. But okay. So you spoke about distributed cognition, right? So we need a way of reducing the combinatorial explosiveness of the environment. So narrative seems to be a way to do that, but the best way of doing that would be a way that still affords self-organizing criticality. And in order, like, it seems to me that the best narrative for doing that would be a narrative that self-references self-organizing criticality in a way that it tells itself. And the thing that strikes, well, I don't know, it's just an idea, but you mentioned, at least in the Buddhism and cognitive science series, that like the idea of history was basically invented by the Israelites. And it strikes me that the narratives before that period of time, they weren't aiming at historical accuracy. They weren't interested in what happened. They were much more interested in telling what to do about what does happen. And so they were like the symbolic integrity took precedence over the historical accuracy. And so that means like we should be looking at these ancient stories as an attempt to actually convey a well, let's say like a metaphysics, but in terms of symbolism. And I think that's because you've been saying that you've been reconsidering the importance of symbolism. And I think that the symbol, it serves as a powerful way for people to actually condense. Well, like, for example, you can put a cross around your neck, and that actually signifies an entire way of life. That's an enormously powerful way to reduce the combinatorial explosiveness of a person. And I think that's what, like, symbols as signs serve as the mediation points that make it possible for people to interact that way. And given in any particular environment, right, there's only going to be a certain number of, let's say, finite, although it's more than that was countable, but there's not every single possibility is viable. There's going to be restrictions, and the fact that that there are restrictions on the viability will probably mean that there will be commonalities in the patterns between the various instances. So yeah, that's just basically what I'm thinking. What I think Jordan Peterson is touching on, and what everybody's like getting so excited about. Because at least for me, the symbolism side of it is the side that's interesting. It's not the political stuff.
I mean, the idea, the idea that symbols are condensations. I mean, that's I agree with that idea. I think it's an important idea. What I'm asking people to remember is you pay a deep price for that condensation. Symbol profoundly ambiguous. Profoundly ambiguous. What does it mean when you hang a cross around your neck? Really, what does it mean? Because many people wear crosses around their neck, and it means many different things, from just jewelry to their devout Christianity. They could be Gnostics. They could be, like, it's all over the place. So the problem you get with the condensation is you get an equal problem of ambiguity. And so I'm trying to say the narrative always depends on the dialogue in which we work out that ambiguity. Because if we stick just with the narrative and just with the symbol, we're bound to ambiguity. Let me give you an analogy, and it's the analogy that people often use. Like, symbols are like pictures. In so many ways, pictures are so powerful. Like, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It condenses. But, you know, as Wittgenstein famously argued, the problem with pictures is they are endlessly ambiguous. I show you a picture, and it's a picture of me. Is it a picture of John? Is it a picture that John's lost weight? Is it a picture that John's not wearing a hat? Is it a picture that John is no longer with Mary? Is it a picture of John when he went to England? What's it a picture of, right? Pictures are relentlessly ambiguous, and you can't disambiguate one picture with another picture. You can't disambiguate one symbol with another symbol. This is what I'm thinking. This is what I keep asking about. I want to know the process that moves us from one narrative to another, that generates narratives, that helps us disambiguate the narratives and the symbols, because as symbols, they are inherently ambiguous. That's my concern. I'm not trying to undermine in any way the importance of symbols.
Well, I'm just thinking though, wouldn't opponent processing lead itself to some kind of a necessary ambiguity? Like isn't the ambiguity of the prodigal of the lost son what makes it effective, in some sense? And I know you're going to say it's not a traditional narrative, but
yeah,
that's what I'm saying. Like you can practice a narrative in many different ways. So you know, I think that there is something.
Yeah, but the point
there's a reason we keep coming back to it.
Well, and I don't deny that, but there's a reason that we also keep leaving it, and that's what I'm also saying. Right? And I think you're exactly right, but I think the opponent processing is between narrative and those things that try to reflect upon and challenge the narrative. And so, for example, you see this in Plato. You see him moving constantly, and he has this deeply ambivalent attitude towards the narrative and the myth. He moves into it, but he also moves out from it, and then gets into dialogue about it. And he goes back and forth between them. And I think becoming more and more impressed with that, and that we need to think about this, because I'm concerned about, narrative bias is a thing, and the ambiguity of symbols is a thing, and I'm worried about an overemphasis. I tried to say in my conversation with Paul and Mary, the first one, I think narrative is really important. I think it's indispensable to becoming a moral person. Both a moral agent and an entity possessing personhood. And I think those are incredibly valuable and important. But I'm worried about this. It feels like there's a move, and I'm not saying it's in you, Strawn. I'm just voicing my concern, about trying to get an exclusivity around narrative, like it's all narrative and narrative's at the bottom. And that to me would limit the capacity we need to recognize the ambiguity, sometimes make use of it, serious play with it. I think you're right. The parables do that. And the parables do that precisely because narrative has that. And it's telling us something. The act of the parable is telling us to be suspicious about the potential tyranny of narrative. That's exactly what it's doing. And I'm interested in what's going on around narrative that allows us to do that, that allows us to challenge that potential tyranny of narrative. We're certainly seeing lots of people who are being tyrannized by narrative right now, and so that's my concern. That's what I'm working on.
Well, I would agree with the project. I definitely think that there's times when narratives can go wrong. I'm not trying to be exclusive in the sense that narrative is the only thing, but at the same time, we need to have a viable narrative. That's not something that we can just sweep under the rug. So it's not. Yeah, I don't know.
I just want to check in that you're okay. We're about 15 minutes over time, John. Want to be respectful of your time. Okay, great.
Maybe I'm trying to split the difference. I take very seriously what Jordan Hall said about how the next Buddha is the Sangha. And I want narratives.
I agree with that. I would agree with in principle that to a large degree. You see, my thinking is that. Sorry, maybe I should let you finish.
Well, I just want to say I want narrative that does two things. Narrative that is aware, that challenges narrative, like the way we've been talking about, in conjunction with narrative that in challenging itself is opens itself up to non-narrative processes that are at work in distributed cognition. Because we don't have a good track record incorporating distributed cognition into narrative. Basically what we do is it's the team around the hero, which is not what distributed cognition is.
Yeah, I agree with basically all of that. I would tend to think of the community as the distributed cognitive agent, I suppose, for lack of a better word. But I just it seems to me that if there's going to be a viable distributed cognitive network, right, then there has to be a feedback loop between the individuals and the distributed network as a whole, signals both going both ways. And I don't know, this is probably taking too much time now, but I think that the whole meaning crisis thing is exactly, you can restate all of the things like you mentioned, significance and mattering and a sense of purpose. All of that's just basically pointing to is that the distributed cognitive system is broken. And so we need to fix that. And I think that basically developing a narrative that actually speaks to that system in a healthy way is what we've got to do. And it's not about, whether it's metaphysically necessary or anything. It's like literally that's the part of our social interaction that's like fried.
I agree with that. And I think people maybe are misunderstanding me. I don't know if you are. I don't want to say that. But I agree with that, but that's precisely why I'm interested in the non-narrative processes that generate narrative, allow us to reformulate narrative and move to alternative narratives. Because that's what we need to do if we're going to come up with a narrative we don't have right now. So that's one of the deep reasons why I'm so interested in dialogos. And that's why I keep quoting, John 1:1, in the beginning was the logos, not in the beginning was the mythos. For me, there's a profound truth there, and I'm trying to understand it, because I agree with you, and I've taken as an implication of that is we've got to get out of the way we've been doing narrative. It's not just coming, if we use the same cultural cognitive grammar, we'll just generate the same kind of narrative. And it's not a matter of generating another narrative. It's a matter, to my mind, of generating another type and kind of narrative. And I think that requires...
I agree with that, basically completely.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I'm trying to get people to hear. And thank you for recognizing that, because I much appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I'm basically trying to agitate, well, from my perspective, to agitate you into the right direction. That's all.
Well, you're completely welcome to do that. You have continually done that, and you've done it well, and you've done it in good faith, and that's much appreciated.
Oh, well, I'm glad you like it, and it makes everything that I've been trying to do feel very worthwhile. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're most welcome. And I should get going now.
Yeah, thank you so much, John.
Lot,
John, this has been great, and thank you so much, everyone. The questions are amazing as always. This is just thank you so much for coming out. This is so much appreciated by the community. These Q&As, and I think there's a lot that gets done in these sessions. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so very much. I mean, I stayed longer for obvious reason. I was having a very good time. So thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Thanks again, John.
Take care. Thank you, everyone. Okay, good night, everyone.
Night. Have a great night.
Take care.
Right.